There's a population living in northern Spain and southwestern France, about 700,000 people. They speak a language with no known relatives anywhere on Earth, not a distant cousin, not a disputed link. No relatives. And when geneticists plot their genome against every other European population on a scatter chart, every single group resolves into a pattern that makes sense. The genetics of Europe, laid out like a map you already know. The Basques don't move. They sit at a set of coordinates that, given what we now know happened to this peninsula 4,000 years ago, should be impossible. They are not where the data says they should be. And for decades, the explanation for that was the one everyone reached for. They must be ancient. They must be survivors. A remnant population carrying something the rest of Europe lost when the first farmers arrived, when the first herders crossed the steppe, when Rome rebuilt the world in its own image. That explanation is wrong. In 2021, a research team at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona published the most comprehensive genomic study of the Basque population ever conducted. 629,000 genome-wide variants, nearly 2,000 modern and ancient individuals, 18 sampling locations across the Basque country. And what they found was not what anyone had argued for the previous 40 years. The Basque genetic signature is not ancient in the way the story goes. The differentiation, the thing that makes them stand apart from every other European population on that scatter chart, does not trace back to the Paleolithic. It does not trace back to the Stone Age. It traces back to the Iron Age, roughly 700 BCE, 2,700 years ago. That's when the vault closed. And here's what nobody explains. If the vault closed that recently, what was it sealing in? And what exactly happened in the centuries before that required a vault at all? Everything I just told you? Hold on to it, because it's about to mean something completely different. If you've ever actually wondered where you come from, not the family story, not the nationality on your passport, but the real biological answer that goes back thousands of years, then subscribe. Because what comes next goes deeper than most people are prepared for. Before we go further, I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely. Drop it in the comments. Have you ever studied a language that felt completely alien to everything else you knew? Not just difficult, structurally alien, because Euskara, the Basque language, has no known relatives anywhere on Earth. I want to know what that experience feels like to you, because by the end of this video, I think you'll understand why that question matters more than it sounds. El Portolón Cave, Atapuerca, northern Spain, one of the most important archaeological sites on the continent. The cave has been continuously occupied, or at least continuously used, for roughly 10,000 years. Bone fragments, pottery, stone tools, metal objects. Every layer is a chapter. And in 2015, a team led by Professor Matthias Jakobsson at Uppsala University in Sweden pulled DNA from 8 individuals buried inside it. Farmers, by the archaeology, the sherds, the grain residue, the settled deposits leave no doubt. These people were not hunters, they planted things, they stayed. The 8 individuals dated to between 5,500 and 3,500 years ago. And when the team compared their genomes to every modern population in Spain, one population came back as the closest genetic match. Not people from the same region, not modern northern Spaniards, the Basques, specifically and genetically, the Basques. But here's where it gets strange. Because the story the world had accepted about the Basques, the one in every documentary, every genetics explainer, every pop science article, was that they were survivors of a pre-farming world. Hunter-gatherers who had somehow held their ground when the Neolithic wave swept in from Anatolia. Europe's last memory of the people who painted the caves. Professor Jakobsson's team looked at that story directly and said, no, the Basques don't trace back to hunter-gatherers. They trace back to these Neolithic farmers who had already mixed with local hunters before the record goes quiet. The origin story was wrong, not completely, but wrong about the layer. The Basques are not a Paleolithic survival. They are a Neolithic snapshot. A genetic photograph of a specific moment in the transition from hunting to farming taken roughly 5,000 years ago, and then somehow preserved while everything around them changed. While Rome arrived, while the Moors crossed the strait, while the Reconquista remade the map, the photograph didn't change. Which brings us back to the question this whole episode is really about. Not what makes the Basques unique, but what it costs to preserve them. Around 4,000 years ago, something moved across Europe. Not an idea, not a trade route. People. People carrying a very specific genetic ancestry, traceable to the grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas, began spreading west and south with a speed and scale that archaeology had always hinted at but couldn't prove. Ancient DNA proved it. And what it showed about the Iberian Peninsula specifically is one of the most stark demographic findings in the entire field. Dr. Inigo Olalde at Harvard's Reich Lab assembled genomic data from 271 ancient Iberians spanning 8,000 years of occupation, a complete time transect of the peninsula. And what the data showed, published in Science in 2019, is this. By approximately 2000 BCE, roughly 40% of Iberia's total ancestry had been replaced by people with steppe-related genetics. New people, a different ancestry, coming in. That's the number everyone cites. Here's the number nobody talks about as much. When the researchers look specifically at the Y chromosome, the marker that tracks the direct male line, the replacement wasn't 40%. It was close to 100%. The paternal genetic signature of pre-Bronze Age Iberia was, for all practical purposes, gone in a few centuries. The men of an entire peninsula, as a genetic lineage, had been replaced. And yet, the overall ancestry number was only 40%, which means the women's contribution, the autosomal DNA carried through female lines, was largely preserved. The men didn't make it, the women did. The field has a term for this. They call it sexual asymmetry of survivors. It sounds clinical. What it describes is not clinical. What it describes is what happened to actual people, to specific communities in specific valleys along specific rivers, sometime around the turn of the 2nd millennium BCE. And the Basques were in this geography. The wave hit their region too. And yet the data from the Iron Age onward shows something different for the Basque country. Not a complete escape, but a measurable difference in how the story ends there compared to everywhere else on the peninsula. The unnamed men who replaced the Iberian male lineage, the men whose steppe ancestry now lives in the Y chromosomes of modern Basque men, left no name in any historical record. They changed a continent. History hasn't given them a sentence. There is a cave called Santi Mamine in the Basque country of northern Spain. It was occupied continuously, or near continuously, from the Mesolithic through the late Roman period. That's a span of roughly 9,000 years of human presence in a single location. In 2017, a team led by Dr. Concepción de la Rua at the University of the Basque Country extracted mitochondrial DNA from 7 individuals found inside. The mitochondrial genome tracks the maternal line, what mothers pass to all their children, unchanged. And the maternal record from Santi Mamia doesn't show the same break the Y chromosome shows. Where the paternal line snapped almost completely during the Bronze Age, the maternal line shows a thread, interrupted in places, thinned, but running. Pre-Neolithic maternal lineages, haplogroups, with roots in the Mesolithic hunter-gatherer world, were still present in the Basque region centuries after the Bronze Age transition that should have erased them. The women held something the men couldn't. This isn't just a Basque story. This is in your DNA right now. The Bronze Age male replacement event wasn't specific to Iberia. It happened across Europe, in Britain, in France, and Germany, to varying degrees. Which means that if you have European ancestry anywhere in your family tree, there is a real probability that your own genome carries the same signature. Maternal lines from a world that was being overwritten. Paternal lines from the people doing the overwriting. Most modern Europeans carry both. The Basques preserved the maternal signal in unusually high fidelity, but the dynamic itself was continent-wide. What the Flores Bello study confirmed in 2021 is that modern Basques carry a lower proportion of Levant and Iran-related Neolithic ancestry and a higher proportion of early Anatolian farmer ancestry than any other European population. That specific combination is the fingerprint of a Neolithic farming community preserved in place through the female line, while the male line was replaced. 700,000 people alive today carry this exact proportional signature in their genomes. Most of them don't know what it means. It means their great-great-grandmothers, going back 100 generations, kept something alive. Not through heroism. Not through resistance. They were alive. They continued. The distinction is the entire point. And what preserved that continuation after the Bronze Age wasn't the mountains. The data is very clear about that. What froze the Iron Age Basque genome in place was something you cannot see on a topographic map. Something that will appear in this story in a way nobody predicted. Buenos Aires, 1944. A physician named Dr. Miguel Echeverri is working with Basque immigrant communities in Argentina. He's recording routine clinical data, blood types, standard medical record keeping, and he notices something that makes him stop and check his numbers again. The frequency of Rh-negative blood in his Basque patients is dramatically higher than anything he's seen in the surrounding population. Not slightly higher, dramatically higher. He records it. He publishes it. And for the next 80 years, this finding becomes one of the most cited and most mythologized anomalies in all of European population genetics. Here's the actual data. A 2018 genomic study from Pompeu Fabra University, the same institution that produced the 2021 study, sequenced the RHD and RHC genes in Basque populations. What they found: 47.2% of Basque chromosomes carry a complete deletion of the RHD gene. 47%. The global average is around 15%. Among most non-European populations, it's below 1%. That number stopped me cold. There are three things that number tells us. The third one is the one that changes everything. First, it is the RHD deletion frequency ever recorded in any population on Earth. Second, neither demographic drift alone nor positive selection fully explains it. The leading model is a founder effect compounded by thousands of years of genetic isolation. Third, and this is the part nobody talks about, in a population with this frequency, before modern medicine existed, this wasn't a medical curiosity. It was a demographic constant with a body count. When a Rh-negative mother carries a second pregnancy by a Rh-positive partner, her immune system can develop antibodies that attack the fetal blood. It's called hemolytic disease of the newborn. It's survivable now. A treatment called Rogam, developed in 1968, prevents it. Before 1968? Before the 20th century. In a Basque community in the 16th century, a woman who was Rh-negative carrying her second child by the same partner was at measurably elevated risk that child would not survive. This happened, repeatedly, for thousands of years. The Basques didn't become genetically unique despite this. They became genetically unique in part because of the same isolation that amplified it. And they survived their own biology. That is not a small thing. I want to pause here because I know some of you watched our last video, the one about the Yamnaya migration and how a single Bronze Age population rewrote the genetics of an entire continent in under 3 centuries. And what we're looking at now is that same event, measured in a completely different way. Not in ancient bones in blood-type frequencies in children who didn't survive infancy. If that video brought you back to this one, I want to hear it. Was it the science that brought you back? Or is there something about this particular story that feels closer to home than it should? Leave it below. I read them. Because honestly, what I'm about to tell you next will make that answer more interesting than you think. Let me make the strongest case I can against everything this episode has argued so far. The Basques are genetically distinct, fine, but so are the Sardinians, also an isolated Mediterranean island population with an outsized proportion of Neolithic farmer ancestry. Also studied extensively as a genetic outlier in Europe, also held up as a remnant of a world before the Bronze Age. The Sardinians don't get documentaries claiming they're the oldest people in Europe. They get studied. And the Finns, strong founder effects, specific haplogroup concentrations, measurable genetic distinctiveness from the European average, also isolated, also studied. The world has isolated populations. Genetic distinctiveness is what happens when gene flow slows down. You don't need ancient magic to explain it. You need geography and time. The 2021 Flores Bello study itself acknowledges that Basque differentiation cannot be attributed to an external origin compared to other Iberian and surrounding populations. In plain language, the Basques are not from somewhere else. They are simply Iberians who received less new genetic input than their neighbors. That's a quantitative difference, not a qualitative one. Founder effect amplification in a small, isolated community explains the Rh-negative frequency. Simple drift explains the haplogroup proportions. The Pyrenees explain the isolation. Nothing about this requires the Basques to be special. That is the strongest case the skeptics can make. And it held up, until one specific finding came back from the 2021 data that the drift plus geography model simply cannot absorb. What they found next changed everything they thought they knew about this. Here it is. When the researchers mapped the genetic differentiation of Basque communities, not just Basques versus non-Basques, but community by community within the Basque country itself, they found something that no topographic map can explain. The genetic boundary between Basque and non-Basque populations does not follow the mountain ranges. It follows the language. The geographic boundary of Euskara-speaking communities is the genetic boundary of the Basque cluster. Communities that speak Euskara are genetically more Basque. Communities that have shifted to Spanish or French, even ones sitting inside the same mountain valleys, sharing the same terrain, are genetically intermediate, positioned precisely between the core Basque cluster and their non-Basque neighbors. The Sardinians don't have this. There is no Sardinian language boundary, genome boundary correlation at this resolution. The Finns don't have this either. What the Basques had, and the Sardinians and Finns did not, was a language so structurally alien to everything surrounding it that it created, in effect, a social immune system. People who spoke Euskara married people who spoke Euskara. People who couldn't speak it couldn't easily enter the community. For generation after generation after generation, the mountain didn't hold the genome, the language did. And that specific mechanism, a non-Indo-European language with no living relatives acting as an invisible genetic barrier, is not replicated at this scale anywhere else in Western Europe. This is not drift. This is a cultural structure with measurable genomic consequences. And it has been running, the data shows, since approximately the Iron Age, since the vault closed. The war to erase that boundary, politically, culturally, linguistically, has never ended. The same genomic fault line, drawn 2,700 years ago, maps with precise alignment onto current political borders. It is not history, it is ongoing. I need to say something clearly now. Because this is the part of the Basque story that almost no one tells correctly, including most of the scientists presenting the data in public. The story we've been building toward has a specific structure. The Basques survived. The Pyrenees protected them. The language sealed them. Their uniqueness is a trophy of successful isolation. It's a clean story. It feels like a victory. It isn't a victory. And the data makes that unavoidable once you look at both pieces of evidence at the same time. Here is the first piece. The 2021 Flores Bello study confirms genetic continuity in the Basque Country since the Iron Age. The autosomal signal, the broad genome-wide ancestry, shows remarkable preservation relative to the rest of Iberia. That part of the story is true. Here is the second piece. The 2019 Olalde study from Harvard's Reich Lab, 271 ancient Iberians, published in Science, shows that by 2000 BCE, close to 100% of Iberia's Y chromosomes had been replaced by men with steppe ancestry. And when you specifically compare Basque Y chromosome age estimates to that replacement timeline, the data places the dominant Basque male haplogroup, R1bs116, at approximately 3,700 to 4,500 years old. Right inside the Bronze Age replacement window, the Basque male lineage was replaced at roughly the same rate as every other region in Iberia. Let that sit for a moment. The population celebrated as Europe's most preserved genetic community, the one whose uniqueness is attributed to surviving intact while everything around them changed, had their male lineage replaced at the same catastrophic rate as their neighbors. What makes them different is not that the Bronze Age didn't happen to them. It did. What makes them different is what happened after. The women who carried the autosomal Neolithic signal through that replacement continued in that specific community. And then, as the Iron Age genetic freeze set in, the Euskara-speaking social world became a wall so impermeable that virtually nothing got through for the next 2,700 years. The Basque genome is the record of a people built by women, on a foundation of replaced men, sealed in place by a language the conquerors could not learn and the neighbors could not penetrate. This discovery connects across time in a way that should stop you completely. Every Basque child born in Bilbao today who learns Euskara before Spanish, every grandmother who passed the language to her grandchildren in a kitchen in Guipuzcoa, every teacher who kept the grammar alive during the decades when doing so was illegal. They were completing a chain of linguistic inheritance that is, simultaneously, a chain of genetic inheritance. The language and the genome are the same artifact. And then there's this. A 2021 analysis of autochthonous Basque Y chromosomes found a residual signal of the pre-Bronze Age male lineage. The paternal lines that were supposedly erased weren't entirely erased. Not much survived. But some did. In the population whose male lineage was supposedly replaced at close to 100%, something from before held on. Supposedly is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Vitoria-Gasteiz, Basque Country, a school called an Ikastola. Children, ages 6 through 10, are learning to read in Euskara, the language with no relatives. They're learning to count, to write, to argue in a grammar that shares no structural logic with Spanish or French or English or German. They don't know they're doing this. They're learning to count. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. The 2021 Flores Bello study didn't just confirm that Basques are genetically distinct from surrounding populations. It quantified something more specific than that. Within the Basque country itself, community by community, the researchers found that the degree of Euskara retention in a given area correlates directly with the degree of genetic differentiation from non-Basque populations. The more a community speaks Euskara, the more genetically distinct it is. The more it has shifted towards Spanish, the more it resembles its neighbors. Individual language choice, aggregated across a community over generations, has left a detectable genomic fingerprint. That Ikastola, those children learning to count, is, in a measurable biological sense, a genetic preservation program. It has been running in one form or another for 2,700 years. In 1936, the Franco regime began systematically suppressing Euskara. Public use was prohibited. Signs were removed. Books were confiscated. The language was treated as a problem to be solved. By the 1970s, only about 21% of the Basque population was still fluent. The Ikastola movement, operating covertly during the dictatorship, some schools hidden in private homes and farmhouses, kept the language alive. The people running those schools were doing cultural work. They were protecting a language they loved. They had no idea they were also, in a genomically measurable way, protecting the genetic archive that the language had been sealing for millennia. The suppression of Euskara was not only a cultural violence, it was a genomic intervention. It almost worked. And then there's the deeper layer. The Flores-Bello study confirmed continuity since the Iron Age, roughly 700 BCE. But a separate analysis of Basque-specific maternal haplogroups traces their Franco-Cantabrian origin to approximately 10,000 years before present. 7,000 years before the Iron Age freeze. What does that mean? The Iron Age is when the vault closed. But what was inside it was already ancient when the vault was built. The women who held the autosomal line through the Bronze Age were carrying something that predated them by thousands of years. 7,000 years older than the story we've been telling. 20,000 years ago. The ice sheets had pushed human populations to the edges of what was survivable in Europe. A few places could still support life. Small refugia where the climate was tolerable and the land could feed a small group of people through a winter. One of those refugia was the Franco-Cantabrian region, the strip of land between the Pyrenees and the Bay of Biscay. The Basque country, more or less. Small groups of hunter-gatherers sheltered in caves, painting walls, tracking animals, surviving. They had no idea they were sitting at what would become one of the most genetically significant locations in all of European history. They were trying not to freeze. But here's where it gets interesting, and this connects to every part of this story. A 2023 study in Nature, led by Vanessa Villalba Muco at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, confirmed that the oldest human remains ever tested from Iberia, a 19,000-year-old individual from El Morón cave in northern Spain, carried the dual ancestry signature of both the Villabruna lineage and the Magdalenian culture groups. The Franco-Cantabrian refugium wasn't a backwater. When the ice retreated and Europe was repopulated, some of the genetic signal from this region spread outward. The people who sheltered here contributed to the repeopling of the continent. But here's what the Basque genome actually is, with full precision. It is not the oldest genome in Europe. It is the closest living approximation to what the European genome looked like before the Neolithic transition and before the Bronze Age replacement, because it is the least modified version of an Iron Age snapshot that itself preserved older material. It is not a Paleolithic fossil. It is a photograph of a moment that was already carrying something ancient when the shutter clicked. And now, before the final word, I want to speak directly to you. If you have Western European ancestry, from Ireland, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, northwestern Germany, your genome carries a proportion of the same Neolithic farming signal that is preserved in concentrated form inside the Basque population. At some diluted frequency, you carry a genetic signature that was already old when Rome was founded. The Basque genome didn't stay only in the Basque country. The women who held it through the Bronze Age had daughters who moved. The signal spread, thinned, diluted, but it spread. The Basques kept a high-fidelity copy. You may be carrying a faded one, whether you know the language it was sealed in or not. If this video has changed something in the way you think about your own ancestry, if any part of this felt less like ancient history and more like recognition, then subscribe. Because the next episode goes further. There are populations carrying genetic archives even older than this one, in places the history books haven't thought to look yet. The last pre-Indo-European language of Western Europe has been spoken continuously for at least 2,700 years, through empire, through invasion, through suppression, through near extinction. Spoken in kitchens and schools and farmhouses by people who had no idea what they were preserving. Their male ancestors were replaced. Their female ancestors held. Their children learned to count in a grammar the surrounding world could not parse. The language did not survive because it was strong. It survived because the people who spoke it never stopped.